Hello there, Dr. Ken here with a lecture on Aristotle and the Empire State for the Ideas of the State module, uh, who again will have access to the notes and slides, but anyone who wishes is welcome to observe this. So what I'll be doing today is talking about the idea of the Empire State, a type of political organization from the ancient world, and then discuss some of Aristotle's views on states in general and politics as well. So, what is an empire state? Well, this is formed when in the ancient world, when a city-state, usually a large and powerful one, comes to dominate other city-states in their regions, um, gaining quite a lot of territory. And some of these empire states have quite vast territory and have diverse ethnic and cultural groups in them. But an empire state still remains at its heart a centralizing city-state, however expansionist, and in its sort of hegemonic aspirations that governed its subject peoples often with a heavy hand. So even in the case of the Roman Empire, the city-state of Rome was the center, and its views, its needs came first and foremost. This is the case with other city-states as well, or empire states, that their capital is the most important part of it, and the other parts are secondary. We can see the ancient empire state as a kind of evolutionary step towards a more the more modern concept of the nation state, with which we're more familiar. There are a number of examples from the ancient world, and I'll be talking about the empire of the Kingdom of Macedon shortly, but I'll just go through some of the other examples. And of course, these are famous big empires that you've probably heard of, some maybe you haven't. One is the Akkadian Empire, and these next ones I'm talking about are going to be from the Bronze Age. So that was established about the year 2334 BC and lasted till about 2154. Located in ancient Mesopotamia, so that's modern day Iraq, roughly. Its capital city was Akkad. It's the first empire that we know of in ancient Mesopotamia, and I say that we know of because occasionally archaeology will discover new things that we were not aware of, and they keep pushing back the oldest cities as new discoveries are made. But as far as we know, the Akkadian Empire is the oldest. It consisted of Akkadians and Sumerians, who were two different peoples that united to form a larger empire, and led initially by a man named Sargon, who was one of their first, I suppose emperors is not quite the right word, but yeah, emperor will do. Scholars have documented over 7,000 texts detailing the Akkadian Empire. This is some of the earliest language, or earliest written language that we have in the world. But they've not yet located the capital city of Akkad, unfortunately. And this is partly because it's in an area that's, well, a bit of a war zone today. But so that empire lasted for about 180 years. It would then be supplanted by the Assyrian Empire, which lasted for quite a bit longer, 1,420 years. So from about 2025 BC to 605 BC. So it actually outlasts the Bronze Age and goes into the Archaic period. And that was founded by Assyria, which is in modern day Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran. And it's had multiple capitals, although its first capital city was called Ashur. And it was typically divided into four areas. I'm not going to go into its history, but there are multiple periods of its history because it lasted so long. And again, what we have is a large centralizing city-state that expands and controls other areas, forming an empire. And it emerges after the fall of the Akkadian Empire. So we don't have the precise history of these events, but it looks as if the fall of the one empire had something to do with the rise of the other. The Babylonian Empire comes next. It was existing alongside the Assyrian Empire. So it's first established about 1894 BC, but lasts only about 300 years to 1595. And that's in southern Mesopotamia, again, modern-day Iraq, capital city being Babylon. Again, it was ruled by a number of well, famous names, including Hammurabi, who gave us the first legal code, as far as we're aware, written down. And it goes into decline after his death and reverts back to smaller kingdoms, although the city of Babylon would remain a very important city-state and would get absorbed into other empires. Another one from the Bronze Age is the Hittite Empire, which was from 1600 BC to about 1178. It lasted 422 years, not too bad as far as empires go, and it was centered in north central Anatolia, so parts of modern-day Turkey. Its capital was Hattusha. And it's one of these, another ancient empire that comes into conflict with the Egyptians, the Assyrians, and would have had contact with the Babylonians as well. And it goes into decline, as I say, falls around 1178. Interestingly enough, a lot of these Bronze Age empires, and it holds true for Egypt as well. I'll come to Egypt in a moment. A lot of these Bronze Age empires go into decline and fall, apart from the Assyrian one, around the end of the Bronze Age, and that probably has to do with the changes in technology. So these societies have been built on technology based on bronze for weapons and tools. When the Iron Age comes along, new weapons, new tools are introduced. Those who can master those are very successful. But whenever there's any kind of industrial revolution, there tends to be a lot of social upheaval. So a lot of the early empires, the empire states, seem to go into decline and fall around this time. The next is Egypt, and you know, as an empire, its height really, I suppose, was about 1550 to 1077 BC. But Egypt carries on, of course, as a power, as a state, more than just a city-state, not quite the same level of being an empire state as it once was after about 1077. So it lasts about 473 years. And its capital shifts over time from Thebes to Memphis, and then later to Alexandria under the Ptolemies. But it of course is obviously one of the more well-known ones. It's a Bronze Age empire state, and I won't go into the names of famous pharaohs, but you will have heard of them. It's got a long history about which we know some, but not as much as we would like. And then it also goes into decline and will get absorbed into the successors to the Assyrians, and that's the next one I want to talk about, the Persian Empire, the Achaemenid Persian Empire. It's established in around 550 BC by a group of people who had been formerly subject to the Assyrians, but then take over their territory and go beyond it, led by a man named Cyrus the Great. It has several capitals during its history. Babylon seems to have been the main political center, or main administrative center, but this empire spanned from all of what's modern-day Turkey to Egypt to Afghanistan and Pakistan as well. So quite a large empire, and it too, again, as I say, is an empire state where one sort of ethnic group in their territory come to dominate a number of others and then expand that territory. And it's really when the Persians encounter the ancient Greeks that the Greeks, as it were, catch the disease of empire, and that leads to some other changes. So the Persian Empire expands to include, as I say, all of Turkey, and on the western coast of Turkey, in what we call Asia Minor, what the ancients called Asia Minor, were a number of Greek city-states who had been established as colonies by the mainland Greeks. And I say colony, these were actually independent city-states, but they were connected to mother cities like Athens and Sparta and other such places. And they come under Persian control. The Persians exert their influence over these Greek city-states, who can't really defend themselves against such a vast power as the Persian Empire. But the Greek city-states back in Greece aren't happy about this. Their allied cities are becoming under the control of this Persian juggernaut. So they start sending military and economic aid to their allies in Asia Minor, stirring up revolts, etc., causing problems for the Persians. And the Persians don't like it. They've got these troublesome Greeks causing problems for them on their western border. So under Xerxes, king of the Shanashah, king of kings, Xerxes, they decide to invade Greece. And Persia has done really well in its empire and its expansion. It's subjugated whole huge vast tracts of area. It's the largest empire in the ancient world for its time. It doesn't expect to have any problem with these primitive, as they see it, and poor, impoverished Greeks. But they do. As it turns out, the Greeks have much superior fighting skills, thanks to the fact that they've been fighting each other for centuries. Also, the lie of the land in Greece is quite different from the open plains in a lot of the territory of the Persians. So when Xerxes comes with his huge armies, there's not as much room for them to fight. And their usual tactic of just sort of enveloping and overwhelming a foe can't quite be brought to bear against the Greeks. So for the first time, really, in Greek history, the Greeks come together and fight against the Persians, and beat them and kick them out in several major engagements on land and on the sea. Xerxes goes home and licks his wounds. But the Persians are a bit taken aback by this. And in fact, arguably, this is perhaps the beginning of the decline of the Persian Empire itself, having met with the first major defeat at the hands of an enemy they expected to be able to overwhelm quite easily. It changes the Persians, but it also changes the Greeks. And the Persians will continue to be involved in Greek affairs. They will use money and other tactics to influence Greek politics from afar, which will again come back to haunt them. But what's changed now in Greece is that, again, for the first time, they've come together, they've stopped fighting each other, come together as a single unified whole to fight the Persians, and it's decided to form a kind of mutual defense pact to prevent, just in case the Persians come back again, but also to cause problems for the Persians. They want some revenge for the invasion as well. So initially, the alliance that defeated the Persians was led mainly by the Spartans. The Athenians, who are an up-and-coming power at this point, don't want to be totally ruled by the Spartans, so they formed their own, called the Delian League. It's nominally based on the island of the sanctuary of Apollo on Delos, where the treasury of the league was kept, but its center is Athens. And then the Spartans formed their league, which is called the Peloponnesian League. So these are two groups of allied states that are existing to, again, ideally, ostensibly, to prevent the Persians from invading Greece again. But it ends up being two major power blocks with opposing ideologies and effectively two empires. Now, the arrangement of the two leagues in Greece is quite different. The Delian League under Athens does come to resemble fairly quickly more of an actual empire. So it's Athens and its allied states. Initially, the idea is that the member states are meant to, in terms of their subscription fees, as it were, provide soldiers and ships, a certain number assessed each year. But in actual fact, most city-states aren't able to produce the level of ships needed. Athens can. It's at the head of a trading empire. So it's decided to let the allies just send money to Athens to pay for the defense of the league against the Persians. And this works very well for Athens. It makes Athens a lot richer than it already was, and it was already fairly rich anyway. So this money is then used to increase Athens' military, its navy in particular, and pretty soon the members of the league, who are initially called allies, are we see them in the text being referred to as subjects of Athens. So much so that even when some of them start to want to defect from the league, Athens comes in with its military force and compels them to remain. The Spartan Peloponnesian League, by contrast, is a lot less stringent, at least initially. So Sparta's allies they're all joined together. The only kind of agreement is that they won't really fight each other, and they won't. And when Sparta asks for soldiers or ships, they'll provide them. Any other agreements they have with other city-states, they have to make themselves. So it's a much looser confederation than what the Athenians have. But these two sides will eventually go to war in what's called the Peloponnesian Wars, 3 major series of conflicts over the span of about 70 or 80 years, actually. And this is where Persia gets involved again. Athens probably should have won that war. It was the better provisioned, the wealthier of the two states. But Persians provide lots of money to the Spartans, help them build a navy, and they use that to defeat the Athenians. Also, the Athenians make some terrible mistakes, perhaps a bit drunk with their level of power and their empire. And it is called an Athenian empire, at least in sources that discuss it in later years. So the Athenians and their league are defeated by the Spartans, and this is when the Spartan league starts to resemble more of an empire, and they, again, maybe drunk with their victory and power, decide to treat it a bit more like an empire state. So these two leagues in Greece kind of represent a Greek approach to empire state. Neither is successful for very long. The Spartans succumb to another emerging power in Greece, led by the city-state of Thebes. We call it the Theban hegemony because they also form a league of subjects and allies, and then develop more professional style militaries, a military that they use then to defeat the Spartans. So the power shifts from Athens to Sparta to Thebes. Meanwhile, Persia in the background messing around with money and espionage and that sort of thing. Meanwhile, another power is rising, and as I say in the notes, when two sides go to war, whatever their difference is to begin with, they start to resemble each other more. So we see the Greeks beginning to adopt a more imperial approach with their league system, and certainly with Athens, and then later with Sparta. Thebes is doing something similar, and Thebes was one of those cities that was overrun by the Persians when they invaded Greece, so they had direct contact with the Persians. Another place that was overrun was the kingdom of Macedon, and this is my next topic that I want to talk about, because they will be the next major power to arise from the Greek world, and they will be the largest and the most influential for quite some time. So really the story is quite old. I don't have time to go into all of Macedonian history, but it was a divided kingdom. It consisted of, again, city-states, although arranged a bit more along the feudal lines. So you have areas under control by what are effectively barons, and then a king in the capital of Pella, he's the one who's able to get the barons on side, although their history is fraught with many internal conflicts. So the kingdom of Macedon is by no means a stable kingdom in and of itself throughout much of its history. But along comes Philip II of Macedon. He doesn't come out of nowhere. Philip was a prince. He was a younger son of the royal family. He wasn't actually intended to inherit the kingdom, but his brother, who was king, was killed in battle, and it's Philip who is able to revenge that death, and then he commands the respect of the barons who elect him king. Now, Philip, in his younger years, had been a prisoner in Thebes. It was customary practice in order to keep states on side, subject states or allied states even to take guest prisoners from these and put them, to treat them well. So, but he was effectively under house arrest in Thebes, where he also received an education at the hands of some of their high-ranking generals. He was a guest in the household of some of their generals, and he learned a lot from the Thebans. He picked up their tactics, their new techniques that were proving so successful, and he adapted and advanced them. So when he's finally released and returns to the kingdom of Macedon, and his brother's king, his brother's name was Perdiccas III, we're told that he quarreled with his brother at court, and a philosopher who was at the court, a philosopher sent there by Plato, interestingly enough, advises, well, let Philip have his own territory to govern as a governor under you, O king, and that'll get him out of court, so he's not causing any trouble. And this is done. Philip is given a territory to rule under his brother's authority. And while he's doing this, that's when he develops his model army, adopting techniques from the Thebans, but also adopting techniques from the Persians as well. And there'll be a lot of elements of the Persian regime, I suppose, or way of doing things politically, adopted into the Macedonian court. So as I say, when his brother is killed in battle, Philip is able to come along with his model army that he's been developing, and the way the Macedonians choose their king, as I say, it's whoever can command the respect of the barons who control the armies, and it's Philip. His brother had a son who was too young to be king, so he's passed over in favor of Philip II of Macedon. And Philip's ambitions didn't end there. He consolidates the kingdom of Macedon. He subjugates a number of the neighboring states that were causing trouble for them, the Illyrians and others, not technically Greeks necessarily, but on the fringe of the Greek world. They're brought under control, and then Philip turns his sights to the southern Greeks, the disunited bunch of southern Greeks who can't get along with each other to help them in spite of themselves. And he, through a complex approach involving battle, but also bribery and sometimes political marriages, Philip is able to exert influence increasingly over areas of southern Greece. The notes tell you a lot of the detail of the conflicts. I'm not going to go through it all now, but it is worth mentioning that one of the key territories that Philip takes is Amphipolis, which had been an Athenian holding, and he takes it because of the gold and silver mines there. It's with the gold and silver he's able then to pay for his army and also to bribe people, which is one of his primary tactics that he uses against. His preference would be, it seems, to bribe or marry. He has something like 9 wives, Philip II. Polygamy was practiced amongst the Macedonians, and each one of them was a political marriage. So they were princesses from either former enemies or allies that he wishes to bring closer. And these are his tactics. They're very effective, especially having lots and lots of money to bribe people with. That works quite well on the Athenians, as it turns out. And he takes advantage of other conflicts that are taking place in Greece to go in and take over other areas, including Delphi, which is the most sacred site in Greece. He gets that under his control. And arguably, the southern Greeks would have been able to defeat Philip at an earlier stage had they come together. But the Athenians hated the Spartans. They had beaten them in the Peloponnesian Wars. The Spartans didn't trust the Athenians because they were democrats and Sparta had an oligarchy. And the Thebans were despised by the Athenians because when Sparta had defeated Athens, Thebes suggested that Sparta should just utterly wipe them out. So none of these southern Greeks could get along. Had they been able to, then they might have come together and defeated Philip. They didn't, and that didn't happen in the end. Finally, after much difficulty, after Philip makes a number of inroads into Greece, and believe me, people were aware of what was going on. So you've got Demosthenes of Athens, the great orator and effective leader of Athens, trying to warn people, saying, we've got to get together, we've got to stop Philip. It wasn't happening. Philip was working very much against him at every level. Finally, it's quite clear that something has to be done. And so the Thebans and the Athenians do reach a kind of accord. They get some other Greek allies on side, and they go to fight Philip at the Battle of Chaeronea in northern Greece, south of Macedon, in the region called Boeotia. The Theban sacred band, that's their professional army, the one they use to create their hegemony, their little empire, is there along with the allied states. Probably the two sides they're not exactly evenly matched, but they're probably more on the southern Greek side than they're on the Macedon side. But Philip uses his model army, and this is where his son as well, Alexander, who will be Alexander III of Macedon, known as the Great. He leads the left flank, Philip leads the right flank. The left flank has to face the sacred band of Thebes, the most elite soldiers of the Greek side. Through a very clever maneuver, Philip, draws the Athenians and their allies into a trap, keeps them occupied while Alexander smashes into the sacred band of Thebes, defeating them utterly. The rest of the Greeks flee, and that's the end of Greek independence in the south. Philip is victorious, and he compels the Greeks then to join what he calls what's called the League of Corinth. And this is before I go back to that, I'm going to read an excerpt from the Battle of Chaeronea, which describes a little bit of what went on there. So. About sunrise, the two armies arrayed themselves for battle. The king ordered his son, Alexander, to lead one wing, though joined to him were some of the best generals. Pardon me, and Alexander was about 17 at the time. Philip himself led the other wing. The Athenians drew up their army, leaving one part of the Boeotians and leading the rest themselves. The battle was fierce and bloody. It continued long with fearful slaughter, but victory was uncertain until Alexander, anxious to give his father proof of his valor, was the first to break through the main body of the enemy, directly opposing him, slaying many and bore down all before him. And his men, pressing on closely, cut to pieces the lines of the enemy, and after the ground had been piled with the dead, put the wing resisting him to flight. The king, too, at the head of his corps, fought with no less boldness and fury, that the glory of victory might not be attributed to his son. He forced the enemy resisting him also to give ground, and at length completely routed them. So, as I say, this was the end of southern Greek independence. All of Greece, apart from Sparta, who stayed out of the affray, all of Greece becomes part of what's called the League of Corinth. And this is Philip's way of consolidating his gains and control of Greece, and further extending the burgeoning empire state that is the Kingdom of Macedon. The League of Corinth has a congress with each league member represented there. They vote, so there is a nominal element of democracy, but supreme authority resides in the president of that council, and that the president is the King of Macedon. And all members of the league have to swear an oath to defend the King of Macedon, or to essentially to follow his lead, and to put down any revolts of anyone who defects from the league. And again, it's like the Peloponnesian League or the Delian League. It's a mutual defense pact, at least in theory, to keep the Persians at bay. And in fact, the plan for the League of Corinth is that they will come together and go off and attack the Persian Empire. There have been all sorts of debates about whether or not this league was just a kind of sinecure, that is to say, if it was in name only, it was just, bold or bald power grab by Philip over southern Greece. And certainly some of the successors to Philip would interfere a lot more in the city-states of southern Greece, but Philip himself and Alexander largely let them run their own affairs as long as they didn't fight each other. That was the one thing. They couldn't fight each other. They couldn't fight him. the king of Macedon, they had to keep the peace. So in many respects, the League of Corinth was actually a pretty good thing for a lot of Greece, because it, for the first time, apart from when they were fighting the Persians, a generation or three before, they're at peace. And commerce can take place, and the only fights they have to worry about are those with the Persians. So Philip's plan then is he perceives that the Persian Empire is weak, and that it's ripe for the picking, as it were. His plan is to go and conquer it. He draws up these plans. He sends some troops ahead as a kind of spearhead into the region near what's modern day Constantinople. He's going to lead this invasion himself, but he gets killed by an assassin just before he's able to go off. And his son, Alexander III, then Alexander the Great, is hailed as king of Macedon, and he'll lead the expedition into Persia. An expedition that, if you were looking at it retrospectively without knowing the outcome of it, you might think it would be doomed to fail, because despite having Greece behind him, the Greeks still weren't very happy about being forced, not to fight each other and to be subject to the kingdom of Macedon. They were looking for any opportunity to revolt or to cause trouble. Alexander went off in debt to pay for his army. The Persians vastly outnumbered them. He was going into Persian territory. There was no absolute guarantee he was going to be successful, but he was in the end. It turns out, again, the model army that Philip had developed and then Alexander expands upon proved too much for the Persians and their more traditional tactics. Time and again, Alexander defeats them in battle. In fact, he's never defeated in battle, and rolls back the Persian Empire. So the kingdom of Macedon becomes the largest empire state in the ancient world. In fact, it would be the largest empire ever until Rome comes along, and Rome was only bigger in territory. Alexander's empire actually had more people in it. The only empire that exceeds Alexander's was in relatively modern times, and that's the British Empire. So this is too vast a subject to consider here, except that it illustrates, Alexander's empire illustrates a model example of an empire state. And it's an unusual one at that, because it's absorbing all of those ancient empire states that I mentioned earlier. What was left of the Assyrian Empire, that is to say the Persian Empire, but Egypt as well. All those territories that had been empire states had been absorbed by other empires is now absorbed into Alexander's empire. What is the capital? Well, the capital seems to have been wherever Alexander was, although there are a number of administrative centers, and of course Pella in Macedon is the nominal capital, but it's really where the king is and his court. In order to keep such a vast, polyglot, multicultural empire, under some kind of control, he generally allows political institutions to remain intact wherever they are. I think this surprised his generals. I think they were expecting he would carve up the vast Persian territory and turn it into, fiefdoms under their control. And in some cases, they are given governorship of territories, but he insists on keeping existing institutions intact, even reinforcing them in some cases. And this makes the locals happy, because they can more or less continue as they have been. It's just they're paying taxes now to the king of Macedon. And it works pretty well while he's alive. Unfortunately for Alexander, he wouldn't live very long. It takes him 13 years to subjugate the Persian Empire, from Greece and Egypt in the west to Samarkand and Babylon and Afghanistan, all the way into India. This vast empire, but then he dies mysteriously of an illness in 323. Now, had he a successor in place, like Philip had been a successor to his brother, or Alexander to his father, things might have gone differently. But Alexander had one child which was illegitimate and still an infant, and another child unborn, and a brother who was considered politically fairly weak, so there weren't any apparent heirs to take over the empire, and Alexander didn't specify who should take over the empire. As a result, there's a brief kind of regency for his children, but the generals decide to carve up the empire amongst themselves and embark on a series of conflicts we call the Wars of the Successors. And these go on for centuries, really, until Rome rises as a power in the West and takes over what's left of Alexander's empire. So, as I say, it's an example of an empire state. Again, a slightly unusual one, and not a very long-lived one, but one that would inspire other empire states as well, like the Romans. When they develop their empire, they start looking to Alexander and his legacy, and in fact absorb much of his old empire into their own. So that's essentially what I want to say about the empire state. But I want to talk a little bit about Aristotle as well. And last time we did the city-state in Plato, because of course Plato was in democratic Athens during its height. Aristotle was also in democratic Athens, but he's a Macedonian, of Macedonian nationality. His father had been a physician to the kings of Macedon, and he himself would be the tutor to Alexander the Great under Philip II. So again, a philosopher who's very plugged into the political affairs at the time. Really, Aristotle is a scientist. His father was a doctor. He himself studied medicine. He studied plants, but also philosophy as well. He was a sort of polymath, we might call him today. He'd been a student at Plato's Academy. He was Plato's principal student, but he disagreed with Plato on some fundamental matters of metaphysics. And so he wasn't asked to lead the academy when Plato died. But he would then go and found his own school called the Lyceum, which taught alongside Plato's academy and was its principal rival. He's called upon by Philip of Macedon to educate young Alexander. So when Alexander's 13, Aristotle is brought in to educate him. It's a heavy tuition fee that Philip pays for Aristotle to educate his son. He will have given him quite a bit of money as well, but Aristotle's hometown of Stagira had been destroyed and its population sold into slavery by Philip during his conquests. In exchange for Aristotle coming to teach Alexander, Philip had to rebuild the town, free all the people who had been sold into slavery, and restore basically the town. So a small city-state was the price of Alexander's tuition. If you think your fees are high, this was something else altogether. Hard to say what sort of influence Aristotle had on Alexander. No doubt the education was first class. Did he influence Alexander's morals or his beliefs? Hard to say. I think that was possibly limited in terms of moral influence, because we know that Aristotle thought of non-Greeks as barbarians, and this was a common view at the time, whereas Alexander seems to treat them more as equals. Alexander was quite happy to incorporate a lot of foreigners into both his army and his government, and to the shock and surprise of many of his generals and barons, he treated the conquered Persians, as equals. So he didn't get that from Aristotle, at any rate. What he did get from Aristotle, we know, was a love of plants, an interest in botany, because a number of what we would call today scientists went along with Alexander on his expedition out east, and brought back many plant samples for study, new plants that people hadn't seen. We owe certain species of apple to Alexander the Great, and the plum, which originates in China, I believe, but he found in India and brought back to the West. So a number of such things. And Aristotle, like Plato, was very interested in the philosophy of government and politics, and he writes a treatise called The Politics, and in it puts forth a number of theories about government, and he talks about what a lawgiver should do. He considers the lawgiver like a craftsman, that is to say, someone who needs to have a specialized skill in government, in politics. Um, and if you read the notes that I put you, it's considered a kind of imprecise comparison, but a functional, useful comparison to make. Um, he's talking about city-states and structures of city-states and different kinds. And like Plato, he's got ideas about what's the best kind, what's the worst kind. Um, Here we have the opening lines of Aristotle's Politics, where he's sort of laying out ideas of state and citizenship. So since we see that every city-state is a sort of community, and that every community is established for the sake of some good, for everyone does everything for the sake of what they believe to be good, it is clear that every community aims at some good, and the community which has the most authority of all and includes all the others all the other aims highest, that is, the good with the most authority. This is what is called the city-state or political community. So he's describing a political community as a group of people with a vested interest coming together to achieve a common good, that is their welfare, their well-being. At least that's how it ought to be, in effect. But he's well aware that not every city-state is like this, and that some are faulty. So he gives us a kind of theory of constitutions and of citizenship, and a constitution is a way of organizing basically the political body of the state. So we might think of a constitution as a written document, but the Greeks thought of it, as I said before in the previous lecture, as a kind of a theoretical approach to how the state should work. And we get that definition more or less from Aristotle. And he describes citizenship. Citizens were actively engaged in the business of governing their state, or should be. And now it's important to remember that in an ancient city-state, especially democracy, but not just democracies, even in oligarchies, citizens had a lot more responsibility for governing. So especially in a democracy like Athens, I mentioned before in the previous lecture, citizens made up the assembly. It was a direct democracy. They weren't being represented by anyone apart from certain higher magistrates. They themselves legislated for themselves. So they had a great deal more enfranchisement than we do in our representative democracies, more directly involved in governing. So Aristotle's definition of the citizen he defines it as a multitude of citizens involved in the direct rule of their state, again for its own good, for their own good as a body politique and as a citizen body. I'm not going to go into all the details. You can read the notes yourselves and see more about his theories, but I will talk about his constitutional theory, where he says constitutions which aim at the common advantage are correct and just without qualification, whereas those which aim only at the advantages of the rulers are deviant and unjust because they involve despotic rule, which is inappropriate for a community of free persons. So, in other words, a good government is one, and a good constitution is one where you've got a government made up of people who are working for a common good. And a bad state is when it's led by individuals who are out for their own gain and the gain of their friends, that sort of thing. So there can be different kinds of governments, and Aristotle seems to favor monarchy, but he favors a kind of constitutional monarchy over the others. So you can have a monarchy. A good one is called kingship, where the king is there to protect the people, to help them out, to work to their advantage. The bad form of that is called tyranny, where the king is all about getting more for himself and making himself richer. You can have an oligarchy or rule by the few. He says that the best form is called aristocracy, and again, as with Plato, aristocracy means rule by the best. So again, the most qualified individuals rule, and they act for the benefit of everyone else. The worst kind, the deviant form of that, he calls oligarchy, and that's where you've got, again, a few rich people who run the state essentially as a cash cow, as a way of making themselves richer. And in terms of many rulers, you can have like a democratic-like system. He calls it a polity, where the citizens are well educated. They understand, a bit like Plato's definition in the Laws. They understand how politics works, and they come together to rule for their own benefit. But then the deviant form, he agrees with Plato here, that democracy, where it's just about sort of everyone gratifying their urges and voting for whatever it is that they want, as opposed to what's best, and being led by individuals who are, again, using that state to their advantage. So there's a kind of like a healthy and a sick version of democracy, if you like. It's adapted, in fact, from Plato's Statesman. These come right out of that. It illustrates Aristotle's education. But and there are other treatises of his where he talks more about these things and expounds upon them. Now, before you think Aristotle, is the greatest thing since sliced bread, he was also rather misogynistic. He didn't think women were deserving of anything really apart from being ruled by men, and he had a very negative view towards foreigners. And he writes at length defending the benefits of slavery. But in terms of his theories of government, some of this is still very much with us. I think Aristotle was probably a genius, even if somewhat morally reprehensible in some respects by modern standards. So ideally, the best constitution for him is the aristocratic one, the rule of the best people. He explores the implications of this argument in the Politics, considering rival claims of the rule of law and the rule of a supremely virtuous individual. And absolute kingship is a limiting case of aristocracy. He doesn't seem to trust absolute kingship, but he seems to like, and a lot of what he seems to favor is an idealized form of the Macedonian government. So you've got a king who is not absolute, who is in some sense checked by his barons and his military, and the military are the citizens as well, so they've got a vested interest in the state. You can kind of stretch the definition a bit, and it seems to fit the kingdom of Macedon, so that's not surprising considering for whom he worked. But there you go. So you can read more about these things yourself. But as I say, Aristotle was plugged into the political status quo of the empire state of the kingdom of Macedon, and a lot of his theories and ideas seem to derive in no small part from that. And I shall leave it at that, and you can look at the notes yourself, peruse those in your own time, and I'll say goodbye from myself and my little historical companion here, Bear. If you've watched all the way to the end, you get to be rewarded with her cuteness, and we'll see you again another time. Bye-bye for now.